In accordance with the State Government Ethics Act, it is the duty of every task force member to avoid both conflicts of interest and the appearances of conflicts of interest. If any task force member has any known conflict of interest or is aware of facts that might create the appearance of such conflict with respect to any matters coming before the task force today, please identify the conflict or the facts that might create the appearance of a conflict to ensure that any inappropriate participation in that matter may be avoided. If at any time any new matter raises a conflict during the meeting, please be sure to identify it at that time. The DRIVE acronym stands for Developing a Representative and Inclusive Vision for Education. And today we embark on that mission to provide our state with a concrete plan to increase the racial and ethnic diversity of our educator workforce. Over the next 7 months, this task force will meet to discuss the current barriers and challenges around the recruitment, preparation, support, and retention of educators of color, and hear from experts in the field to develop recommendations to tackle these complex issues. Each of you were selected for this task force because of your commitment to this mission and the expertise that you bring to this conversation. The task force will meet at least 4 times between now and the end of the year. Each meeting will discuss a major area of focus for this work: recruitment, preparation, and support and retention. Business will proceed if a quorum is present. Following each whole group meeting, the subcommittee responsible for that meeting's topic will convene to develop recommendations to be presented at the next whole group meeting. On the screen, you now will see the current list of subcommittee assignments based on your survey responses. Regardless of whether your name appears on this list, we value all input, so you are welcome to attend any subcommittee meeting throughout the year. I'll pause just for a moment so you can make sure you find your name as it appears on the screen. I'd like to now take a moment to introduce the DRIVE Task Force Executive Committee appointed by the Governor. These members will lead our subcommittees and support in developing content for our meetings. For our Recruitment Subcommittee, Dr. Lisa Eads, Mr. Guy Hill, and Dr. Leslie Locklear. For our Preparation Subcommittee, Dr. Anita Appenfels, Dr. Cheryl Miller-Dice, and Mr. Eric Sanchez. And for our Support and Retention Subcommittee, Dr. Eric Bracey, Dr. Van Dempsey, and Mrs. Sabrina Peacock. And again, we thank our subcommittee members, our subcommittee chairs, for serving in this capacity. At this time, I would like to welcome Mrs. Latanya Patillo, Teacher Advisor to the Governor, to provide remarks.
Thank you, Dr. Graham. Good afternoon, everyone. I am happy to bring greetings to you today on behalf of Governor Cooper. And I want to begin by thanking the Hunt Institute for continuing on this journey with us as partners to advance the work of the DRIVE Task Force. As Dr. Graham said, DRIVE stands for Developing a Representative and Inclusive Vision for Education. And as Governor Cooper has said previously, he is committed to ensuring that government be representative of the people that it serves, and that certainly applies to education. By establishing this task force, he has demonstrated his commitment to continue the work initiated at the DRIVE Summit last year by working with partners from across the state to develop solutions and actions that will not only increase representation, but that will ensure that all students receive the best education possible. This is critical work that we will do, and so on his behalf, I will thank you all for agreeing to support this effort by coming together to serve as a member of the task force. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Patillo, for your support and your leadership in organizing this task force. In addition to Mrs. Patillo's support from the Governor's Office, the work of the task force is also supported by the Hunt Institute, and again, we thank the Hunt Institute for the work that you do. At this time, I would like to introduce Dr. Javed Siddiqui, President and CEO of the Hunt Institute, to bring greetings. Good afternoon, Dr. Siddiqui.
Thank you, Dr. Graham. The Institute was honored to support facilitating the December's Drive Summit, and we are ecstatic to have been asked to work alongside the Governor's Office in facilitating the critical work of the Drive Task Force. As a former teacher and principal myself, I've seen firsthand the role that educators of color have in affirming student identity and improving outcomes for all students, and we're so grateful to have been asked to take part in developing this vision for a more representative educator workforce. I want to thank all for giving your time and energy to this endeavor. I'd like to give special thanks to the Governor's Office, Latanya specifically, and Dr. Graham for their leadership through this process. With that, Dr. Graham, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you again, Dr. Siddiqui. We truly express our sincere appreciation to the Hunt Institute for your support of this critically important work for the people of the great state of North Carolina. So again, thank you. At this time, I would like to welcome Mr. James E. Ford, Executive Director of the Center for Racial Equity and Education, to present regarding the history of racial and ethnic diversity in North Carolina public education. If you have questions for our presenters, please message our meeting host through the chat feature on the right side of the WebEx platform, and you will be recognized to share your questions. Mr. Ford, good afternoon. Glad to have you here. I believe you're muted, Mr. Ford. We need to get you unmuted there.
I'm sorry. I should be used to this by now. I've been on this thing all day. I believe I may have to be sent presenter privileges one more time before I can accept to advance the slides. But Dr. Graham, I do want to thank you for allowing myself to be here. I bring greetings on behalf of not only myself, but on the Center for Racial Equity and Education, and my colleague Janine Bryant, who's also in the audience today. Let's see here. All right, here we are. So I'm going to be presenting with the time allotted, which is 20 minutes, and I'll be adhering to that. Just a bit of context about the racial and ethnic diversity of schools and also education in North Carolina. Most of the information you all have received in advance. These are excerpts and general themes taken from a document we produced last year. Myself and soon to be Dr. Ethan Roy from UNCG produced a document that looked at the history of race and education in North Carolina, specific to the North Carolina context, called Deep Rooted. And before we begin, there's a couple of themes that I want us just to keep in mind as we peer through each of these slides that are going to be dominant in all of our discourse today. And one is that Black people in particular in North Carolina have always pursued education as a path to freedom. And that's something that you'll see as we work our way through this. In addition to that, you'll see that the politics of race have always influenced education. In other words, we make the argument that it's impossible to untether this idea of race from education in North Carolina. And I think that we have enough historical artifacts to support that. Also, efforts to marginalize Black educational efforts and pursuits are a consistent pattern. At every turn, at every stage of public education, we see that this thing continues to rear its head. And even now, in a modern contemporary context, policy has restricted opportunity, not just for Black students, but also for other groups of color as we become more of a technicolor society, not just Black or white. And ultimately, we're here to support this idea that race matters in this context, which I think we all can agree upon at this juncture. So just kind of beginning, one thing about North Carolina as a colony, we know that Carolina Colony was one of the earliest sort of slave-based, plantocracies in the United States of America. And those Black slave populations were primarily concentrated in the eastern part of the county. That's important to know because although we're far removed from slavery, I think when we start looking at educational outcomes, what you'll notice is that regionally, the eastern part of the state, whether it be down east or whether it be northeast, continues to be an area that suffers in just about every educational metric, but it's also consequently an area where you have pretty large groups of Black, in some cases Latinx and Native American students and populations as well. There's a history behind that that has to be acknowledged as part of the context as we begin this discussion as part of this summit. The other thing is to recognize that, this has not been benign. The workings against the pursuit of education has entailed violence, coercion, negotiation, and so there was a concerted effort to keep education from being distributed and administered to these populations. And the reason is, I think objectively, is that education has represented a threat to the social order. For the enslaved, education itself, the pursuit of education, was an act of resistance. It was largely illegal for enslaved persons or for free persons to teach the enslaved how to gain literacy, how to gain numeracy, and that's because of all the other sort of capital that it would afford an enslaved person. So an enslaved person could begin to think critically, could distribute abolitionist literature, and furthermore, it could give visions of freedom. When you think about folks like Wilmington native David Walker's Appeal, and if you are not familiar with that document, I think it's worthwhile to look at. These sort of things, as they were produced by Black people and then distributed, sent shockwaves through the entire South, but North Carolina was no exception. And it also brought fear of uprising and unruliness from the enslaved populations of Black folks. We pulled this quote and we put it in here. It's an actual quote from the North Carolina General Assembly. It's one of the Black codes, which are characteristic of all Southern governments in response to the threat of literacy. And it says that teaching of slaves to read and write has a tendency to excite dissatisfaction on their minds and to produce insurrection and rebellion to the manifest injury of the citizens of the state. Why is this quote important? Because, again, it supports the idea that the threat to the racial hierarchy in the embodiment of enslaved people being able to read and write was something that folks were fully aware of and cognizant of even as they constructed these laws. But this institution evolved despite the best efforts of those who were against it. We know, of course, the Civil War and in fact, Reconstruction represented the first real formal opportunities for formerly enslaved people to engage in learning, whereas they were doing it on their own in church basements and stealing away, even though it was technically illegal, with organizations like the Freedmen's Bureau and the American Missionary Association. You had folks coming from the North, primarily white folks, and you had free Black folks who were erecting schools. And these were oftentimes makeshift schools that were not very fully staffed. They didn't have formal structures or brick and mortar buildings, but nonetheless, there was an insatiable desire within these very communities who had spent generations being enslaved, now pursuing this insatiable desire to learn, to know. And so a lot of the narratives that are often used to associate with the contemporary achievement gap of individuals sort of sulking into learned helplessness, the history just doesn't bear that out. These were Black teachers who had not received formal training, many of them, but were finding ways to administer learning, teaching and learning to a largely formerly enslaved Black population. I included this quote, and it's edited because I wanted to illuminate that this was not a benign sort of reaction to the idea of Black people pursuing education. As I mentioned, it was met with violence and coercion, and to many folks, just response to the idea of Black folks being educated themselves and pursuing education, it was visceral, and it represents a certain worldview. And so it says, this quote says, "The N-words were bad enough before you came," referring to the carpetbaggers and those who are now erecting schools. "But since you have been teaching them, they know too much and are a damn sight worse." I think this is important because as we pursue an agenda like that, even in contemporary times, we need to know that there will be resistance, and it won't be purely due to a difference in politics, but rather it'll be influenced by ideology that is very, pardon the pun, very deep-rooted. Constitutional Convention of 1868 represents the first time that North Carolina erects a truly universal public education system, one that is available to both Blacks and whites. However, it's important to note that the curriculum that was made available largely represented a curriculum that was designed to make Blacks useful and profitable laborers. It was still designed to fit Black people into their appropriate place, again, animated by this ideology of who should be on top and who should be on bottom. And so they weren't being exposed to a classical liberal arts education where you're reading Aristotle and you're learning about music and you're engaging in critical thinking. These are largely normal schools, industrial schools, where you're being taught to be laborers. Despite that, we should mention there's a Black teaching tradition that even in those industrial schools was still exposing folks to higher level learning. And, Dr. James Anderson and Vanessa Siddle Walker are scholars who have researched those things. But still, there's violent resistance, again, documented resistance of violence just to this idea of opening up public education and making it universal for Black and white folks, and the thought of these folks occupying the same spaces. And then, of course, after Reconstruction ends, there is the takeover again of state houses, North Carolina being no exception, and instantly legalized segregation is instituted. And this is where we get the separate and allegedly equal systems that are existing, education systems that exist. And this is where segregation becomes formalized. But in addition to that, there's the deliberate creation of inequities between these two systems. They are designed to not be competitive. They are designed to be underfunded, under-resourced. And I think that when we look at documents, even in the present, to kind of take a look at the ways in which schools and school districts that are primarily populated by folks of color, sort of disparities in funding, it's important to connect that to a historical backdrop. It was animated by a white supremacy campaign. These are not my words when I say white supremacy. These are literally the words of folks such as Governor Aycock during this time. It's important to note that even in a segregated environment, though, that there were still efforts within Black communities, communities of color writ large, to educate. You had northern philanthropists who were making their way down into the South, and they were erecting schools. They were providing matching grants so that these communities could erect their own schools, even though they be under the governance of the Department of Public Instruction, erecting their own school buildings. The Rosenwald Fund is such a fund that created numerous Black schools in North Carolina, but all throughout the South. But North Carolina having more Rosenwald schools than any other state in all of the Union, and then funds to offer for teachers, Black teachers, to fill these school buildings, such as the Jeans Fund. So the role that philanthropy played in helping to close the gaps and at least create some sort of parity whereby there could be Black schools and Black teachers is really a story that deserves to be told and part of this context. But nevertheless, it's important to note that inequity still persisted in this environment. It was never equal. And this is, of course, a picture which is included in our document, but it shows in Beaufort County what such a Rosenwald school would look like. It's a building that would house all of the grades in one place. Oftentimes, it wasn't even as well constructed as this, but these are the environments that Black children were expected to learn. In many cases, did excel. It's important also to encapsulate, although this is not an exhaustive sort of look, that there's an additional experience. We talk about Black and Indigenous people of color in North Carolina. That for Indigenous folk, there's a particular story about how their educational experience evolved in North Carolina. We have 8 recognized tribes in North Carolina. And these students did not possess the same educational rights as Black and white students because the racial binary is kind of in place. And so if you weren't white and if you weren't identified as Black, you weren't necessarily entitled to the same educational rights. And so tribes began sort of independently creating their own schools. And such a tribe that has done that is the Coharie tribe. In 1943, in that segregated environment, they created their own school, the East Carolina Indian School, that allowed for Indian teachers to come teach in those buildings, but also Native and Indigenous students to get education in those environments. And it was overseen by the Department of Public Instruction, but ultimately these were schools that were controlled within community. Hiawassee Tribal School in 1957 being another example of that. Once desegregation was implemented, these schools did close. In 2000, however, the Hiawassee Tribal School was reopened as a charter school, assuming the same name. But there's a particular story for Native folk, even in this arc and this trajectory. This is a picture of principal and students at the East Carolina Indian School as well. So, of course, we know about Brown versus Board of Education, what that did eventually for the desegregation effort, and how North Carolina handled that was not seamless. Governor Umstead, along with Thomas Pearsall, who was part of the Education Committee, created a plan to undermine desegregation. It was went by his namesake, called the Pearsall Plan. And what it essentially did was afforded white students the right to attend different schools if their schools were undergoing integration. And in some cases, dollars associated with those schools would be transferred out. They could go to a private school. It frankly resembles a lot like what the modern voucher system does today. And in some cases, it offered school districts the opportunity to shut down if they wanted to resist integration. This happened in some cases, not to the extent that it did in a state like Virginia, per se. But this sort of legislation was an active sort of, again, resistant ideology to the notion of equalizing educational opportunity for all. This is a quote from a Klan member at one of those rallies we include in our text, where it says, "If the Pearsall Plan doesn't work, the Smith and Wesson Plan will." So again, I offer context here because at one point in time, North Carolina had the largest numerical membership of Ku Klux Klan in the entire country. There's a documentary called Klansville, PBS documentary you can look at that talks about that. But there's an ideology, and I won't skirt around the edges, that we have to be prepared to engage in when we start talking about introducing more teachers of color into the school pipeline. And then lastly, what we have to recognize is that the absence of teachers of color in the classroom, as I mentioned, there's a history there that incorporated and brought Black and Indigenous teachers into these classrooms, and then now we find ourselves with huge gaps. This is not an uncaused first cause. This is the result of deliberate policy. Most public schools, as a part of desegregation through almost a 10-year period, there was a large-scale laying off of Black teachers. As districts desegregated or quote-unquote integrated, Black teachers were not a part of that process. They were summarily, in many cases, let go. Scores of Black educators, more than 3,000 teachers in North Carolina alone, more than any other state in the South with the exception of Texas, laid off. 500 elementary principals, and all the superintendents in North Carolina, Black superintendents, were laid off. And this is why you had cases like Hyde County who fought to try to keep those traditional Black schools open because they understood the virtue of having teachers and educators of color in that space. But we find ourselves with a diversity gap now, not because of just a general lack of interest, but policy has created this gaping chasm, which leaves us now with trying to incorporate and bring more folks of color into the field. And then lastly, I'm a former educator from Charlotte-Mecklenburg, and, we've talked a lot about the desegregation of schools in Charlotte-Mecklenburg, which is a sad story because of Charlotte's history at being a district that essentially in 1971 taught the rest of the country how to desegregate using busing. Charlotte-Mecklenburg incorporated a desegregation model, but it's important to understand that even as we were integrating quote-unquote, these schools, there was still a large absence of teachers of color that were filling these schools, and in many cases, fundamentally inequitable and still segregated schooling environment within the schools. This led to a white flight phenomenon where many white students and white, and teachers and themselves left the district, but it also sets the context for where we find ourselves presently. And so it's important to recognize the role of SWAN in the history of sort of the color composition of who is in our schools, but also who sits in the seat of instruction. And most recently, the Leandro case. We should know about this case. It's almost 30 years in running now at this point. There's been plenty of developments, of course, at the behest of the governor to understand how we're making progress on that and providing a sound basic education to all. And what the West End report documents is that in addition to the fact that we have failed to offer a sound basic education, that increasing the number of teachers of color, right, that many of your low wealth districts are consequently also districts with the highest composition of students of color. And the immediacy of the need to increase teacher diversity is a part of that document. And so it's important to frame this not just as a racial equity issue, it is, but as an equity issue writ large, and us maintaining our constitutional obligation to fulfill that mandate. We're gonna have to find ways, creative ways, and we're gonna have to employ a sense of urgency from all the stakeholders to respond to finding tons of alternatives to offering Black, Latinx, and Native teachers here. You'll find that I don't have a slide here about the Latinx experience, but I do want to offer the caveat that North Carolina is recognized as a Latinx hypergrowth area, meaning that for the past 20 and 30 years, the population in North Carolina has exponentially grown. And many individuals have migrated not just from Mexico, but from Central America as well. And even though our overall public school enrollment now is at 17% Latinx students. We only have roughly 2.3% Latinx teachers. So that's a tremendous mismatch. And so whatever benefits are accrued to an individual who's being taught by a same race, same ethnicity teacher, it appears to be concentrated into the hands of the mostly white students in our public school enrollment. And so with that, I just wanted to offer my contact information as well as Ms. Janine Bryant's, and I'll open it up for any questions, Dr. Graham.
Mr. Ford, thank you. Fantastic presentation. At this time, I'm going to recognize Ms. Aliyah Abdur-Rahman so she can pose a question that she presented in the chat area.
Hi, thank you for that, James. I think you started getting to this in a lot of what you were sharing before, but I wanted to know if you had any anecdotes or specific information around numbers of Black schools, if you will, that existed before anyone came from the North and the South to, start educating. I just think it's important to talk about that when you talk about the context of education as an act of resistance. Thank you.
That's an excellent question. I will say that many of the reference texts and the scholars that we referred to are included in the bibliography of Deep Rooted. I don't have particular numbers on that. I do think it'd be complicated simply because of what constitutes a school, right, in the formal sense. Many of the schools that were erected before the North, these were makeshift schools, right? So these were people gathering in the basements of churches, people stealing away into the woods where they were no longer under the guise or under the gaze of their slave masters or of the authorities. And so in truth, those were schools, right, but not in the formal sense. And so I do think it'd be difficult to get an accurate number, but there may be one of the scholars whose literature we reference who might be able to offer a more cogent and a close and accurate response to that.
At this time, I'll ask if there are any task force members who may have questions for Mr. Ford. I'll ask that if you'll please recognize yourself by name, and then we'll let you pose that question to Mr. Ford. All right. The good teacher in me wants to make sure I give you some wait time. All right. Hearing no questions, again, thank you, Mr. Ford and Ms. Bryant, for your presentation. Thanks for providing us with a historical, political, and ideological context for what's been happening in the state of North Carolina relative to public education. I hope that we will keep this information and continue to do our homework and dig and delve a little bit more as we think as a task force about the task that's ahead of us relative to diversifying the educator workforce. So again, thank you, Mr. Ford. Thank you, Ms. Bryant, for taking time to join us this afternoon.
Thank you, and thank you to the task force for doing this work.
All right, we will move forward. And again, task force members, throughout our meeting today, if you have any questions, please remember to use the chat feature over on the right side of the screen, and we will make sure that we recognize you so we can engage in this conversation. At this time, I'd like to welcome Dr. Constance Lindsay, Assistant Professor of Educational Leadership with the School of Education at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, who will present on the research supporting the need for and the development of a diverse educator workforce. Again, task force members, please use the chat area should you have questions throughout Dr. Lindsay's presentation. Dr. Lindsay, thank you for being with us this afternoon.
Hey, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. And then I should have the controls, which I don't know that I have. Let's see. Is that? Oh, there we go. Awesome. Okay. So thanks so much for inviting me to speak to the task force today. I'm going to give you an overview of some of the research that's out there on the impact of having a same race teacher for students of color, talk a little bit about why it's an exciting time for North Carolina when it comes to a lot of these studies, and then also speak a little bit about some of the other research that I have going on that's in this area that might be useful for you all as you sort of think about the charge of the task force and the work that you have ahead. Okay. So why diverse teachers? So there are several studies that have come out in the past few years that sort of are able to isolate this relationship and this positive impact of having a same-race teacher for students of color, and in particular for Black students. And there's one thing that we're able to do, thanks to the investments of many places like North Carolina, where we have these nice longitudinal data sets, is we're able to track both teachers and students over time and sort of look at a lot of these issues from a broad scale. So just to give you a little bit of the history sort of in this little subfield of education research, the most sort of famous original papers were done by a guy named Tom Dee out at Stanford. And he used basically an experiment called the Tennessee Star experiment, which basically was a class size experiment to look at the relationship between, is that me? Okay. Am I echoing? Yeah, there we go. Okay. To basically look at the relationship between having a same-race teacher for Black students who were kindergartners. And so Tennessee Star is a super exciting sort of project from an educational perspective because it was what's called a randomized controlled trial. And so he basically had the novel idea that if you can randomize by class size, you can also randomize by race. And so therefore he was able to isolate this effect. And so basically what he showed was for those kids who were those Black kids who were randomly assigned to a Black teacher, they were more likely to have higher test scores. There's a professor at NC State, Ana Agalate, one of my co-authors and colleague, who also has a paper that uses Florida longitudinal data where they show something similar for high school students, that for Black high school students, if you have a Black teacher, you are more likely to have higher test scores, sort of holding all things equal. Then myself and some colleagues also have a few more papers that sort of look at this issue of teacher-student race match. So one paper that I have with my colleague Cassie Hart at UC Davis is using North Carolina data. We look at the years 2008 to 2013, and we find that for Black students who are assigned to a Black teacher, they are less likely to receive disciplinary action. So things like in-school suspensions, out-of-school suspensions, things along those lines. So you can think about that as sort of the beginning stages of the school to prison pipeline, right? Exclusionary discipline is particularly of concern because it takes kids out of the classroom. And so while we don't find large effects in that study, we find relatively consistent effects. We find that it doesn't matter whether the kids are free and reduced price lunch or not, whether they're in an urban area or not. The effects pretty much hold up sort of no matter what kind of kid. If you're sort of exposed to that, if you're a Black kid who's exposed to that marginal Black teacher, you're less likely to get to receive these types of harsh discipline outcomes. The other thing I'll mention there, so I'll mention a few things there, and this actually follows up nicely with Mr. Ford's comments about the Latinx students. When we first set out to do this discipline paper, we were just going to look at sort of all students of color matched with all different teachers of color. And so one thing that becomes, there's a few sort of stylized facts that we found. So one, there's a growing Latinx population in North Carolina, but there aren't enough Latinx teachers for us to sort of have the power that researchers call it to be able to explore these types of matches. And so it just basically means that there aren't enough Latinx teachers in the data set for us to be able to observe them to make the sort of estimates that we do. The other thing I'll mention too is that in this particular sample, so these are our students in North Carolina at all levels, so elementary, middle, and high school from 2008 to 2013, over 50% of the students in our sample never had a Black teacher at all. And so one of the things that I think that's important is we have to think about how we're sort of utilizing our existing workforce as well. But we can certainly come back to that. The final paper that I'll talk about is actually a paper that looks at long-run outcomes. Okay? And so this is a paper that we have. There's actually a couple of versions of it. The most recent version came out in 2018 via the National Bureau of Economic Research. And so basically what we do in this paper is two things. So the first is we follow up with the kids that Tom D. looked at in the Tennessee STAR experiment. And we say, if you had a Black teacher in those early years, are you more likely to matriculate into college? And are you less likely to drop out of high school? And then another big chunk of what we do there is we use North Carolina data to basically do the same thing using some slightly different methods. And so what we find there, and this is, if you've ever sort of heard people quote sort of the one Black teacher paper, this is the paper. Basically what we find is that having at least one Black teacher for students in grades 3 through 5 leads to a host of positive outcomes in terms of being less likely to drop out of high school and more likely to say that they'll attend college in the North Carolina data, and then actually matriculating into community college in the Tennessee data. And so this particular paper has gotten a lot of attention, but there's some important nuances that I wanted to draw to it for our discussion today. So one, the effects are the largest in the long run paper. So you think about the kids who are in early grades and then they have these impacts later on. The effects are largest for what we define as persistently low income young Black men. And so these are Black boys who are on free and reduced price lunch the entirety of their elementary school experience. And so there's results for all Black kids, but their results are sort of outsized. So if you've ever seen people quoting like the 40% reduced dropout rate, that's what they're quoting here. And so it's really driven by what we know is a very persistently disadvantaged group. And so those are some of the studies that I've worked on that sort of that use North Carolina data. And I think that's super exciting because a lot of times if I present this to other people in other states, they'll say, well, that's all good, but that's not my state, but it is our state. So that's super exciting. So we can we have the data right here. So just to talk a little bit about what's happening nationally. So the teaching profession, and I think most people sort of know this by now, but the teaching profession is largely white and female, okay? And this is basically taken from a data visualization that I did when I was still at the Urban Institute, where basically we sort of looked at individuals aged 25 through 34 using census data and sort of captured national representation gaps in the teaching force. And so if you think about, so the blue bars are teachers and the yellow bars are students. And so you can think about the sort of gaps between the bars as representation gaps. And so what you see is that basically the student population is more diverse than the teaching population, but the gap is largest for our Latinx students. And I can make all of this available. And when you drill down to North Carolina, so if you go to the data visualization, you can actually play around with some of the data, but we find that the state's about 40% kids of color, and the teacher workforce is about 19%. So that's just thinking sort of white, non-white, not Black, and not Black and white. Okay. So the question then becomes sort of, now what? What should we do about this? Why is this important? And so that's what I'm trying to do sort of with my research as it moves forward. And again, this is exciting because this is taking place right in Chapel Hill. Okay, so there's a few things that I have going on, and I'd be happy to sort of speak about this. The way I like to think about this is sort of thinking about the human capital pipeline and the ways in which we might intervene at different sort of stages on that pipeline to get different effects. One of the things that we talk about at the end of the long run paper, I think, is just this idea that there are sort of short-term solutions in terms of how we're distributing our teachers of color, and then also longer-term solutions in terms of just expanding the workforce. So I have work that actually it's out for review right now, where we're just basically looking at the relationship between student debt loads and teacher diversity. And basically what we find is that for Black and Latinx students, they generally have to access loans to access college. But once they get past a certain tipping point, they're less likely to say that I'm going to become a teacher. Other work that I have going on is looking at just implicit bias training for teachers, and, you know, sort of thinking about short-term ways to sort of retrain the existing workforce around the biases that they may have. Also with Anna Egalite, who's over at NC State, we are looking at we're using North Carolina data to look at the relationship between principal-teacher race match and teacher turnover. And I can give you a preview of those results. So again, using the North Carolina data, and I should say, I didn't give my disclaimer, which is that I'm new to UNC this year, but I actually went to Duke for undergrad. So I did want to give Duke a shout out because Duke has NC-ERDC, which holds all the data that I use, even though I guess it's also housed at Carolina, but I use the Duke version. So we're basically looking to see, you know, once we get folks in the classroom, what are some factors that might keep them in the classroom longer? And so one of the things that we look at is for Black teachers who are matched to a Black principal, are they less likely to turn over, sort of given this idea that we know that Black teachers move around a little bit more. And one of the things that we do find is that being matched to a Black principal for Black teachers mitigates some of that turnover gap, but does not eliminate it. And so that's even controlling for things like working conditions, right? So working conditions can be like, is it a Title I school? You know, what percentages of the kids are on free and reduced price lunch, things along those lines. And then another project that I have going on is basically looking at leadership. And so understanding how to develop leaders and what does that look like. So we're doing a national study of just looking at the trajectories of TFA alums of color, and sort of tracking, for those who have chosen to stay in education, tracking where they end up and what their careers look like and how well they felt or how well prepared they felt to lead those careers. And so those are the things that we have sort of going on now. So I'll stop there and we can open it up for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Lindsay. Great presentation. At this point, before I acknowledge the questions, there have been a couple of questions asking about accessibility of the presentations and papers to which the facilitators have referred. We're going to work to put in place a platform where task force members will have access to these presentations and some of the papers to which the facilitators are referring. We'll try to work to get those assembled as well, so you'll have access to them so you can read and study a little bit more. Having said that, it looks like we've got two questions specifically for Dr. Lindsay. I want to recognize our individuals posing those questions. So the first is Alexandra Zagbayou. If you'll please present your question.
Sure. Thank you for this presentation, Dr. Lindsay. My question is around additional characteristics that students might have attributed to their Black teachers. This is in regards to when we think about preparation for teachers of color that we will be working towards. I'd be interested to hear what are the goalposts that might inform the work that we do or how we might imagine supporting them in the short and long term.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So again, I'll give you a couple of I'll give you a little bit of a non-answer and then an answer. So with these particular types of studies, we're most interested in sort of just like assessing to see whether the relationship is there. And then we can sort of try to back out what some of the mechanisms are. But I don't want to speak too much to the mechanisms because there's only so much that sort of large-scale administrative studies can do when it comes to sort of telling us, you know, what are the behaviors, what are the actual things that are happening in the classroom, so because I can't see that. But I think there are some things that we could sort of back out from the studies. So in particular for the discipline study, so we find that the largest drops are in what we categorize in the paper as willful defiance incidents, right? And so those are incidents where it's basically going to be some cultural mismatch or misunderstanding of behavior between the teacher and the student, and then the teacher has to use, you know, his or her own discretion to determine what happens to the student, right? And so that might lend itself to training. It's obviously a call for cultural competence. And so you can just imagine that if that's sort of what's driving some of this, that's probably something that we could focus on in terms of like the training. Because, you know, a lot of this is sort of thinking about what might we learn also for white teachers as well, right? So yeah, so a big piece of that for the discipline study. And then I already spoke a bit about who's driving the impacts for the long run study. Another piece of that too is that most of those students who, so one of the things that we posit is that maybe it's a role model effect as well, which is it's a relatively controversial thing to say, but like I said, we can't see that. We can only see that the relationship is there. Most of me trying to guess what's actually happening in the classroom would be sort of stepping a little bit outside of what my data show. Was that helpful?
Thank you. Yes, that's helpful.
Great question. Next on my list here, I have Rebecca Blanchard.
Thank you so much, Dr. Graham. Thank you so much for this presentation, Dr. Lindsay. Particularly knowing that you're a Dookie gives me incredible confidence in the research and just the caliber of your work, even if you're doing it at Carolina now. So my perspectives are coming from, I advise early childhood policy for DHHS, Office of the Secretary. And I'm really interested in thinking through where is there research to show that there is a bigger impact, however we define that, on children's educational outcomes or well-being, let's say, long-term in school, depending on what grade they had that educator of color. And I'm wondering from a brain development standpoint, from a socio-emotional standpoint, I would imagine it would be higher impact, again, whatever that means, in the earlier grades. And I would just love to hear your thoughts on that question.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, so for the long run paper, we look at the early grades because we can follow them out. They're now old enough for us to kind of see what happened to them. We don't, but from that short 3 to 5 time period, we don't find different. So we do a bunch of tests to see whether it's 3rd, 4th, or 5th matters more, the order, if you have, more than one, if you have, 2 versus 1, and we basically find it's just at least 1 during that time period. Now, but to your point, though, there are some really good studies that show that how early childhood educators might rate kids' behavior differently sort of earlier. I think there's a guy named Walter Gilliam at Yale who has a really nice study. And so sort of, I think, given what we know sort of from this line of research and also the early childhood ed, I mean, I would say earlier is probably better, for sure.
Representative Zach Hawkins, you have a question?
Yes, sir. Thank you for allowing me to ask my question. Thank you, Dr. Lindsay, for the presentation. And you can decide if my question needs to be addressed at another time. But one of the natural things in North Carolina that comes up for me is if we know, and it popped up because of the sort of the TSA leadership portion about what schools are producing the majority of our teachers of color, right? And because if those teachers staying in the classroom longer, are they going throughout the pipeline to be administrators, and potentially sort of infusing them into the understanding of what they're taught and how they're taught and what they're bringing to the table. And so it may be, again, I don't know that number. I don't know which schools are producing the most teachers of color, but that could be helpful to know and helpful to infuse and include them in some discussions around some of this.
Sure, yeah. So I actually have and I can also send this around too. I'll send it to Kyle. I have another data visualization that I did with the when I sold the Urban Institute, which basically takes all of the colleges of education around the country and compares them to their larger student bodies to basically look and see whether their colleges of education were underrepresented, sort of given the racial composition of their student body. And so basically what we found, and I don't think this is a super shock, is that the minority serving institutions, so HBCUs, and I don't want to butcher the official names of the other types of institutions, but for sure the HBCUs are producing way more than their fair share of educators and are so sort of over and above what you would expect given the compositions of their workforce. And so one thing that we definitely have to do is think about how to provide support to the places that are producing educators of color, and then also sort of hold our other institutions, and I don't know if my dean's on here, our other institutions accountable for being more diverse. But I can definitely send that around, and you can look it up. You can look up every individual college, any college you'd like to, and I mean, it's certainly the case in North Carolina as well. But we know that the minority serving institutions are sort of producing more than their fair share of educators of color. Great question.
Great question. Mr. Guy Hill, you have an inquiry.
Yes, I was just wondering, either Mr. Ford or Dr. Lindsay can answer this question. The percentage of African American students in North Carolina as opposed to the percentage of African American teachers in North Carolina. What is that ratio?
Sure. So you got muddled a little bit towards the end. You said the percentage of you said the percentage
of
just repeat it for me.
The percentage of Black teachers in North Carolina as opposed to the percentage of Black students in North Carolina.
Oh, so I don't have the exact number off the top of my head. I have, so this chart that I showed was, oops, wrong way, this is just non-white versus white. Sorry, this is non-white students and non-white teachers. And generally the Black teacher percentage is like around at the 13% level. I don't have the percent of Black students off the top of my head. I think it's about 30%, but that's something I can look up for you for sure.
We can tag team on that one. So the Black students is 26%.
Okay.
So it's yeah. And Dr. Tomlin, I think certainly DPI has the exact numbers, but as I mentioned, like 17% of Latinx students. So in general enrollment is for students of color is 26% Black, 17% Latinx Hispanic, 4% mixed race, 3% Asian, 1% Native. But in terms of the composition of the teaching workforce, that's where it gets a little more difficult for me on my end.
Yeah. So again, this would be my from whatever the latest year I have, which would have been, like sanitized, sent over to the data repository. So Tom would definitely have the most up-to-date numbers.
Thank you, Mr. Ford, for jumping in. And we will have Dr. Tomberlin speaking here in about 8 minutes. So I'm certain we'll hit on some more of these statistics and data. I also want to call your attention to a link that Cal put up from the Hunt Institute. It's an issue brief that talks about the landscape of educator diversity in North Carolina. So if you have not had a chance to take a look at that PDF file, I encourage you to read it and become more familiar with what our landscape is in the state of North Carolina. Next question I have here is from Claudia Sandoval.
Hi, thank you so much, Dr. Lindsay. I really enjoyed your presentation. And when you discussed a little bit about Latinx people in North Carolina and having difficulty doing those studies, the Latinx people, as you know, compose different races. So I was wondering if you had some studies looking at a teacher of color of any race having a positive impact on test scores or other metrics on a different race or ethnicity than the teacher's race or ethnicity.
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, that's a great question. No, you generally don't see that. And I think this is actually a really excellent point because we are very much confined by how the data are recorded, which can be sort of in very antiquated ways, right? So like you have to check like Latinx, but you're not checking like another ethnicity or something like that. But there, to my knowledge, I have not seen any studies that just sort of do sort of any teacher of color with any student of color. Yeah, I'm not familiar with that. There are some papers that are looking at sort of Latinx teachers as a whole. There is, I know of a study that's similar to ours that's using Miami data, and they see similar results with the long-term outcomes. I'm also going to be working on a study of Texas data where we're going to try to do the same thing. But what's nice about Texas is that we can do things like ELL status, different sort of nuanced ways of looking at it instead of trying to look at it as that one umbrella. That's just pause for now because you have to physically go to Texas to work on the data, and we can't do that. But that's a great question. But I think is also sort of is reminding me to sort of just mention that some of this is just constrained by the ways in which we record things. And so if we can't capture it accurately, or if it's not captured in the data, then we won't be able to see it.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We also have a question from Ashley. Ashley, I always mess up your last name, so I apologize in advance. Ashley Kazoo.
So I just wanted to go back to Alexandra's question earlier. I think it was a really good question, and I appreciate the way that you answered it. But I just wanted to know, are there any studies that you or Mr. Ford know of that kind of tease out those characteristics for teachers of color that are going to the classroom to kind of see? I guess it would be more of a qualitative study to see what are the things that teachers are needing or bringing to the table through preparation. And I have a couple of questions. Sorry, that question, and then also would those characteristics relate to positive identity development of students of color once they're in the classroom?
Yeah, so I'm not as familiar on the qualitative side, but there is a guy named Donald Eason Watkins who writes heavily on, so some people call it race matching, some people call it ethnic matching. He calls it ethnic matching. I don't know that I've seen particular studies that try to capture the behaviors. I should also take a second to mention my colleague Esther Ojito, who also joined. We're both new this year at UNC, who she actually studies Black pedagogy. So that's one of the things that we're going to be looking into working on together, is if maybe we can do some of this mixed methods research here in North Carolina. But no, I'm not familiar off the top of my head. But your question, it makes tons of sense, right? Like, we really need to understand what the actual behavior is. And you know, because that's useful both sort of, it's useful for preparation, it's useful for how we think about evaluation rubrics, it's useful for a number of things. So I think that's a great point.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I could attempt, but I won't, because I feel like the composition of the task force is strong enough. You have some individuals, think Dr. Chance Lewis, like this is at least one of the areas that's like part of his research agenda. So as y'all, you know, sort of work on, you know, figuring this stuff out, you guys have a wealth of capital, even as part of the task force, folks who direct you to that stuff.
We have time for one more inquiry.
Well, I was just going to say from my side, this is Chance Lewis. Many of the questions that were asked, I can send a few resources that we could disseminate that could help answer some of those questions as well for the task force.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Lewis.
Okay.
All right. Dr. Lindsay, we thank you immensely for your presentation, having us think about diversity and how we go about looking at each area, the pre-service, the induction, the mentoring, and so forth. Very enlightening, and don't be surprised if we call upon you in a few months here to come back and engage us.
Okay, awesome. Sounds good.
All right, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
At this time, I would like to welcome our final presenter for today, Dr. Tom Tomberlin. Dr. Tomberlin is the Director of Educator Recruitment and Support at the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction. He will present on the current landscape of educator diversity in North Carolina. We'll continue to use the same format we've been using, so please post your questions in the chat area, and I will recognize you after Dr. Tomberlin's presentation. Dr. Tomberlin, thank you for being with us, and it's good to see you this afternoon.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Great. And let me see if I have control. Yes. So I'm going to start my presentation with a question to the Hunt Institute. Where did you Google that picture of me? That's kind of I wish I still looked like that. Anyway, I am Tom Tomberlin. I'm the Director of Educator Recruitment and Support at the Department of Public Instruction. And in that role, I manage just about every aspect of teacher human capital that you can think of in relation to teachers. So that begins with recruitment and hopefully ends with a long and illustrious career ending with retirement of our teachers. And so all the licensing, all the effectiveness measures of those teachers falls under our division. And this, I am just enormously gratified, one, to be able to follow Dr. Lindsay. I'm a huge fan of her work. And two, to talk about this subject that's been really critical to my work since I began at the department. So what I would like to do today is just give you a landscape of the data that we collect at the agency related to teacher diversity and other metrics and teacher preparation, the pipeline. And I'd like to just talk to you about what kinds of data we have available and the kinds of things the types of research we could support, as well as what our vision is moving forward. So let me just jump right in there. And my goal is to talk less and hear more from you. So I'm hoping that I can move through this very quickly and then take time for your questions. So the educator data collection is basically housed in two separate units of my division, and that's the Educator Preparation Office. The Ed Prep group oversees the EPPs in the state of North Carolina, the Educator Prep programs, and so they collect a lot of data on teacher candidate enrollment and candidate completion. They're also responsible for reporting out to the General Assembly and to the public the effectiveness of those educator preparations programs. So we do this largely through an EPP dashboard, EPP performance reports, and an EPP report card. And I'm going to show you some data from each of those things and how we're working to create a more user-friendly and public-facing dashboard that displays all that information. And then the other way that we report on the human capital pipeline in the state is through the North Carolina State of the Teaching Profession Report. And this year, in the 2018-19 report, we just began doing some comparative work on student-to-teacher demographics and disaggregating our attrition reporting by race and ethnicity. So I want to show you a couple of those things and highlight some points in the data that I think are particularly interesting, and then certainly take your questions. And all right, so I'm clicking my presentation, and I realize I'm not advancing your presentation. So this is a shot from the EPP dashboard. And as you can see, what we're doing is we're looking at all EPPs across the state in terms of three major components of teacher preparation or teacher quality measures for the EPP. And that is how the teachers are evaluated in their first 3 years of service in the state of North Carolina, how those teachers fare on our student growth measure, and how the candidates themselves feel that they were prepared for the job of teaching in North Carolina by their educator prep programs. And so there you see the percentages for everybody, those big blue blocks. And you can see that 96% of our beginning teachers are rated at a proficient or higher level. 82% are meeting or exceeding their growth targets with their students. And 76% of them feel like they were well prepared for the job of teaching coming out of their ed prep program. Then to the right of that, we have the disaggregation by gender, so males and females and how they're reporting out on that. And then last, you have a breakdown of race and ethnicity. And those are sorted by percentage of agreement or positive. And as you can see here, our American Indian Alaska Native category is rather small, but 97% of them are meeting or exceeding proficiency on the evaluation system. And you can see African American teachers at 94% are the lowest of a very high percentage of that. But then you look at the growth of these teachers with their students that they're serving. And here, these numbers are a little lower because, evaluation is a somewhat subjective measure, but the student growth measure is designed to measure the teacher's impact on the student above and beyond what we would expect in an average year of student growth. And here we have the Hispanic population showing 84% of them are meeting or exceeding expected growth. And it goes on down the list there. And then finally, the satisfaction with the EPPs. What's interesting to me about this is the African American and Hispanic population have the highest satisfaction with their programs, but especially for the African American group, that satisfaction doesn't manifest in commensurate outcomes on the teacher evaluation or the student growth portion of this. And so that's an interesting little observation from that. I can't say that any of these things are statistically significant or represent anything, but we do see a largely positive experience from our African American and Hispanic communities in relation to their educator preparation. Surprisingly, Asian is quite low. That would be interesting to know what what's behind those reportings of feeling of lack of preparation for the role. So one of the other things that we cover in our reporting is the EPP performance report. Now, these performance reports are static documents that are housed on the NCDPI website. They're there for every EPP. No one ever looks at them, but they have a wealth of information about how the EPPs are doing, especially in relation to enrolling teachers of color into their programs. And as you can see here for this particular institution, which is a rather large institution, the numbers relative of minority candidates relative to the overall pool is very, very small. And so if you think about this, this is a large EPP housed in a large university. Certainly 5 total African-American candidates out of 880 total EPP participants is not reflective of the general population of the university, and that's an issue that came up with Dr. Lindsay. Is the idea of looking at an EPP's racial diversity as related to their overall institution diversity, and should those things be in somewhat alignment? And I'm sad to report that it doesn't seem like that is the case. And so, but this information that you see here currently exists only in a static form, but the goal is to take this and other reports that we do on EPPs annually and incorporate them into that dashboard. So our hope is the public and our good friends in the General Assembly will have an easy way to look at EPPs and how they're doing, not only performance-wise, but for supporting our efforts to increase diversity in our teaching force across the state. So this slide is from our EPP report card. And as you can see here, we provide information on the number of full-time students enrolled in the program. And this is an annual measure. This is all students in all years of their program. So again, you can see this is a fairly large institution. And then we have the statistics on those students' performance on SAT, ACT, and their overall GPA. How long it takes them to graduate, how many of them complete the degree but have not applied for licensure. So if you look down in the transition to classroom, the second line there, so you have the number of completing the degree but not applied for a license. That's 227, and only 223 did complete the program and did apply for the license. So more students are completing the program at this EPP than are actually and not being licensed than those who are actually being licensed. So I don't know the racial makeup of those groups, but that's a really interesting thing that could be looked into. What is putting these teachers off from going ahead and getting the license and engaging in the workforce in North Carolina? And understanding that question could really help us boost not only the overall pipeline, but certainly those of minority candidates as well. So those are just some of the data points that we capture in this work. And I don't want you to get the feeling that I'm showing you the only data from that. These reports are massive for each EPP, and there's so much in there to go through and look at. And again, as I said, that's really time-consuming and difficult for most folks. So our goal with the dashboard is to pull all this data in and be able to report on this publicly, so everyone has access to that information. So from the State of the Teaching Profession report, and again, I'm giving you two data displays that come out of that report for the 18-19 school year that relates specifically to diversity. But there is just an abundance of information and analyses in that report. I would urge you all to look at it if you want to understand the human capital pipeline in the state of North Carolina better. But one of the things I did this year that I haven't done in the past is to look at the number of students by demographic across the state for the 18-19 school year, and those numbers are presented on the left there, the number of students and the percentages. Now, I have to issue a caveat here. This is, we know these demographics only through self-report. No one's required to provide their demographics. So, you know, you've got, I think, you've got about a 2 or 3% non-reporting group here. So, but I'm pretty confident that these numbers are pretty representative of what the actual numbers would be. And then to the right of that, you see the teachers that serve those students and their racial breakdown. So for African American, you can see that our teaching population represents roughly a little more than half of what our student population is in the field. If you continue on, a lot of these numbers are very small, but I think of importance here is the Hispanic Latinx population, where you see that 17.9% of those students, 17.9% of our students are of Hispanic origin, and only 2.5% of our teachers are. So that's about 7 times the student population as compared to the teaching population. And then, of course, as I think is in no surprise to anyone, that the white teachers are overrepresented in the teaching force relative to the student population. Not quite 2 to 1, but certainly 1.5 times or more of the white student population. So that's that breakdown in those ratios that you can look at and see. This, I think, provides us a good starting point for discussions about diversity. What is at least the short-term goal? What's a manageable goal? I certainly, you know, think about this in terms of, you know, how can we, you know, the first phase of this could be how can we get our teaching force to be reflective of the student population? And certainly we could go beyond and above that, but that seems like a reasonable and attainable goal. And something certainly to include in some kind of vision for moving forward. The other thing that I was able to do this year is look at the attrition rate of teachers from the state by demographic. And so now, as you saw before, the numbers are kind of small here. So what I've done is constructed a confidence interval around that percentage of attrition to see if what we're seeing, if the state average falls within the confidence interval for any of our demographic groups. And so it really, you can see for Pacific Islander, because it's so small, it has such a huge confidence interval that I can't really say that Pacific Islanders are leaving the state at a greater rate, though that 14% sure looks like it, but really, because that group is so small, the confidence interval is quite large. Of course, if you look on the far right, white pretty much defines the average, so it's not surprising that it's, you know, the average is well within the confidence interval of whites. But what's really interesting to me is the African American is virtually indistinguishable from the average or from whites. So our African American population is not leaving the profession at any greater rate, which is good news for efforts to improve the pipeline, to increase African Americans in the pipeline. We know that they're not differentially leaving at higher rates, so we're not kind of trying to fill the bathtub with the drain open. We know that, you know, the more we can put into this, the more we can increase those percentages because they're not leaving at greater rates. Unfortunately, I can't say the same thing for Hispanic and Latinx populations. What you see there is it looks like about a 9.5% attrition rate from the field, and that is within the confidence interval. And Asians are also leaving at rates greater than what is the average. And so there, the response for our Hispanic community would be we have a dual we have a two-prong attack for addressing those diversity issues for that group. We need to understand how we get more teachers of Hispanic origin into the pipeline. Also, how do we lower that attrition rate and make them more persistent in the profession, so that we're just not recycling, but we're actually adding to that group. So one of the questions I received were, what barriers exist for data collection in the state of North Carolina around these measures? And the answer is none. North Carolina has the luxury of having a highly centralized data collection system. We get very robust reporting from the EPPs and the LEAs. We have more data than I think all of our esteemed researchers across the state could ever analyze in a decade. So really the problem is not, do we have the data to understand what's going on? The real problem is capacity. So a lot of these data are protected by privacy issues, and so the state has some difficulty in kind of sharing out these data, but we also lack the capacity in-house to do kind of the robust research such as Dr. Constance, I can't remember her last name, Constance was talking about earlier. That is a barrier for us. And how do we make these data actionable, and how do we how do we not simultaneously discredit our EPPs and our LEAs for the great work they're doing, but make apparent that this is an issue that needs to be addressed across the state? And with that, I am happy to take any questions or comments that you might have, or insights or suggestions.
Thank you, Dr. Tomberlin. Before I turn to questions, I wanted to call your attention. Dr. Kim Evans posted a link in the chat area. Dr. Evans is from DPI. It will take you to the dashboards, the performance reports, and the report cards, so you can do some further study and analysis there. Dr. Locklear, I will come to you first. I know you posed a question in the chat. Mr. Hill may have answered your question, but I wanted to make sure I acknowledge you.
Yes, Dr. Graham, I was going to say Mr. Hill did answer my question or gave me some direction that I plan to look into, but thank you for acknowledging.
Great. And thank you, Mr. Hill, for providing that response. Representative Hawkins, I'll come to you now. I think you posed a question as well. I think Dr. Evans may have addressed your question, but I want to see if you might have further inquiry there.
No, the link answered my question. I really appreciate the data.
Fantastic. Ms. Plantard, I'll come to you next.
Thank you so much, Dr. Graham. I feel like some of this question may have been answered, but I was asking about how confident you are in the reliability of these data, in how each EPP would report race and ethnicity data of their teachers, or how teachers would self-report those data. But it already sounds like there might be, because that information is voluntary anyway to collect. I wonder if you have thoughts there. And then a second easy question for you. Are pre-K teachers, anyone with a BK license, is that included in this data collection? Thanks.
So great questions. To the first question, I would respond, there may be some, I would say, wonkiness in the data being reported from the EPPs. there may be some, so really we're getting sources on these teachers from a couple of different ways. We're getting it from the EPP. If they apply for licensure, they may or may not report their race on that licensure, but that's linked back to their EPP. And so if there's discrepancies there, we can resolve those discrepancies. And then again, in employment, it's asked again there. So without sounding like sinister or anything, there may be very good reasons why a candidate might not want to report their race for an EPP or for licensure or for the application process, but then maybe more forthcoming once they get a job in the LEA to say, identify themselves as part of a racial group. And if that occurs anywhere along that line, we're able to capture that data and kind of retroactively apply it to other sources in our data. And then your second question totally escaped me. I'm not a Dookie, so I struggle sometimes.
I forgive you. It was, our BK licensed teachers included? Does this include early childhood?
Yes, so that's a great question. So the BK, so let me go back real quick to, so they would be included in this type of reporting where we're looking at undergraduate or licensure only candidates. So the numbers, if they would be embedded in those numbers somewhere. Where they wouldn't be is perhaps in the teacher evaluation. Some of our BK teachers will teach in private pre-K. They're still licensed and they're still governed by DHHS, but they may or may not be included in our evaluation system. And then, of course, they would not have any student growth measure, so they would not be reflected there. So, and I should point out, while I'm pointing out areas where people might not show up, for the student growth, of course, if a teacher's not teaching in one of our core subjects, they would not have that student growth metric. So not all the teachers that are represented in the teacher evaluation are included in the student growth, and not all the teachers who do the candidate satisfaction are included in the teacher evaluation or the student growth. So these are different populations, but there is a significant core that is represented throughout all three of those measures.
We also have a question from Leroy Ray.
Again, I don't know if this question pertains to your presentation. Thank you for the presentation. But my question was, when we talk about pipeline, where do you consider the pipeline to start?
I think that's a great question. If you asked me this 2 years ago, I would say the pipeline started with the EPP programs. So once a student matriculated into an educator prep program, we would start the process of monitoring and measuring. Since that time, we've entered into an initiative with Best NC to market North Carolina as a teaching, a place for teachers from all over the country to come. And so now our office is going to be engaged in kind of the marketing and recruitment aspect of this, which is an area that DPI has never traditionally been involved in. All the jobs in North Carolina will be centrally housed at the state level. So we'll know where all those vacancies are, and we'll be able to leverage the teach.org website and marketing tools to push out those available jobs across the country. So our hope is that this is another way to increase the diversity pipeline. But I would venture to say that in most states, they are dealing with the same issues related to diversity that North Carolina is. I don't have any reason to believe that this is North Carolina specific.
Dr. Tumblin, I have a quick question for you, and it's really more for context purpose for all task force members. Can you talk with us a little bit about the accountability model that exists, or if one exists, for educator preparation programs when it comes to diversifying students in those programs?
Yes, let me talk about the accountability model broadly. So in statute, there is an accountability model defined for ed prep programs. And the state model looks at the measures that you see here on the screen. But with that, when the statute was created to develop that model, there was also a provision that said State Board of Education can come back and propose another model, a better model for measuring the performance of EPPs, which was an extraordinary opportunity that we, of course, took advantage of. So working with PEPC, which is our Professional Educator Preparation Standards Commission, which is an advisory body to the State Board, we have started the process of defining what that different model would be. And one of the domains within that new model is a diversity measure for the EPPs. As you can imagine, it's been really difficult to land on the exact place of what that should look like. And we have many deans of education across the state working on this, HR directors from across the state, some superintendents. So a lot of people are kind of putting their heads together to say, what can an EPP be held accountable, or what should an EPP be held accountable for in terms of increasing the diversity of their candidate pool. And I don't have anything to report on that yet, but tomorrow is a regularly scheduled meeting of PEPC, and I invite you all to listen in and see where we are in moving towards that goal. And you have a great resource on your team here. Dr. Kim Evans works very closely as the administrator for PEPC. So everything that we're doing in that regard, she will have the best and latest knowledge to share with you insofar as she's able. So I really hope that, I'm very excited that you have her as part of your team here, because she's going to be really a great liaison for how we can support you in your work with the data that we have and can bring to bear on your questions. She will be a great liaison there.
Thank you, Dr. Tomberlin. And I think you also have two other members on the task force who serve on the PEPC Commission. Dr. Dempsey and I both serve on that commission. And if I'm overlooking anyone else, I apologize. So you have at least three people from the PEPC Commission. That meeting is tomorrow at 9:00 a.m. And I see Ms. Sandoval, your question in the chat area. We'll make sure you get the information so that you can tune in and listen to the PEPC Commission meeting. So at this time, it's 3:40, and I said earlier I'm a stickler for time. I know there are a couple of other questions. We're going to have a general discussion here in just a few moments, but I want to thank Dr. Tomberlin for his time. He always does a masterful job presenting a very complex data set. So thank you, Dr. Tomberlin, for engaging us this afternoon.
Thank you for the opportunity.
What I'd like to do at this point, before we turn to general discussion, I want to circle back just for a moment and talk about the charge for the task force and what our work shall entail over the next few months. If you have not had an opportunity as of yet to read Governor Cooper's Executive Order number 113, I would encourage you to do so. It's 3, maybe 4 pages in length. It's very short, very manageable, very readable. But please make sure you read that document carefully to familiarize yourself with what it is we've been asked to do as a task force. At this time, I'm going to share these slides with you, and I apologize for reading to you, but I am a former high school English teacher, and reading to people is what we do. So in the Executive Order 113, we have been asked to prepare and submit a report that we will refer to as the plan moving forward to the Office of the Governor no later than January the 1st, 2021. So we have a very few short months to get our work done. This plan should accomplish the following. The plan should assess the state's progress in increasing educator diversity in K-12 public schools. The plan should identify short-term, mid-range, and long-term strategies to increase educator diversity. The plan should identify stakeholders, assets, and sources of funding that can be leveraged to recruit, retain, develop, and support more educators of color. The plan should propose metrics and standards by which the governor can evaluate the state's success in achieving its goals underneath the plan and improve recruitment, retention, development, and support of educators of color. And the plan should identify what recommendations for increasing educator diversity in the state should be prioritized and addressed. This task force has also been asked to think about ways that support that stakeholders in seeking funding to enhance educator diversity serve as a general forum for educator diversity and educator equity matters affecting North Carolina, and this task force should provide advice on any other matters the governor refers to the task force. So our charge is wholly, by and large, the plan that must be constructed and composed and submitted to the governor's office. So we have had conversations with the executive committee, those subcommittee chairs. So as we break out into our groups and then reconvene, all of our conversations, all of our actions, all of our behaviors should focus back in on this plan that is due by January 1, 2021. As I shared with the executive committee members in our meeting prior to this meeting, we want to make sure we're taking full advantage of these spaces to create a very comprehensive, robust, and informed plan that leads to actionable, executable efforts. This is not a space for just talking only. We want to talk, yes. We want to converse, yes. But we want to lead to action. We don't get many opportunities in this space. So we want to take full advantage of this opportunity. As I shared, this is for the first time that I've been in education in North Carolina since 1997, that I've seen a commitment by the state to move from interest to investment. So we need to take full advantage of this investment and make certain that we are producing something that can really change the landscape of what we do in the state of North Carolina. So with that, what I want to do at this point is spend about 8 minutes thereabout to engage in some general discussion. I'm going to open the floor, and I will ask that you please identify yourself by name before you begin speaking, and we'll facilitate a conversation at this point. And these could be additional questions that you might want to pursue, additional presenters that you may say we need to hear from, things that might be occurring here in the state of North Carolina or nationally that we might need to pay attention to, so on and so forth. So I will step back now and allow us to engage in this discussion.
Dr. Graham, this is Chance Lewis. Just have a quick question. If you could go back to your previous slide, just wanted to clarify, which may help our work forward on point number 2 with the short, mid-range, and long-term strategies. Do we know an estimated time period that should be in?
That's a good question. I'm going to punt to Mrs. Patillo to see if there might be some clarity there, or our colleagues at the Hunt Institute.
Thank you, and good question. I think that would be for the task force to set a time frame on how long, the strategies, or how long we need to have those strategies reach out, right? So I think that is part of our task, is to not only determine the strategies, but determine what that time frame would be. And I would encourage us to, again, think, short, mid-range, and long-term strategies, because we know that this isn't quick work. that this has to be done in phases. So short answer to your question is no, there is no set time. I believe that is for the task force to determine.
Okay, thank you.
Others?
Hi, this is Dr. Claudia Sandoval. I was wondering if we'll get follow-up emails from the subcommittee chairs about time frame of meeting, logistics in terms of those things, and agenda.
Yes, as a matter of fact, in one of our next slides, you will see those proposed dates and the time frames. So we'll share that with you here very shortly.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sandoval.
Hi,
this is for, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No.
Alexandra, I think we'll go to you.
Okay, I have a question around how we will ground our work as far as metrics. We just received a lot of information that was incredibly helpful, and my brain is going a million directions around, are we talking numbers? Are we talking about numbers plus impact in the classroom? What exactly are we naming as our North Star? It feels really important to make sure that all of our different subcommittees are working towards the same goals. And so I'd be interested in what would be the process of us doing that work collectively to agree upon a set of metrics that would inform all the subcommittee work.
Great question. I think it kind of refers back to what Mrs. Patillo just shared. I think the task force is going to have to drive how we're defining what those metrics are, what our North Star is. So that work will really be contingent upon this collective body as we think about the short-term, mid-range, long-term. So I think that's work yet to come, and it will be really placed in our laps to come up with those metrics and what we consider as those assessment points.
If I could build upon Alexandra's point, this is Aaliyah Abdurrahman.
Yes.
I know that the goal for all of us is to really have a holistic approach, even though we're on different task force and things like that. We're on different subcommittees. I just think if we could get some guidance or find a way for us to be able to share some ideas about how we might start with some shared vision around either those metrics or our understanding of how we should be thinking about the different subcommittees holistically. I just think that's really important because, again, we continue to talk about increasing the diversity, which is great, but to what we've seen here, it's not just that, right? It's the retention as well. It's ensuring that the environment of the school is accepting to those educators of color. So I just really would love for us to find a mechanism or some way, and maybe I ask that for the subcommittee chairs, for us to start really thinking about how we have some initial conversations across subcommittees around the shared vision, whether it's across metrics, whether it's across like the outcome that we want to see. And maybe there's some ways for us to contribute to that so you all don't just have to take that on your own in terms of thinking about ways for us to have that conversation.
Duly noted.
Hi, this is Kim Evans, and I wanted to first correct one thing that Dr. Chamberlain said. He said tomorrow would be a Pepsi meeting, and that will not be until next Thursday, and it will be at 9 o'clock. I can send the announcement to a point person, and then they can send it out to the whole group, and that would come out on Tuesday morning, 48 hours before the meeting, so that everyone could listen, or whoever was interested could listen. So I just wonder if that would be Dr. Graham or Ms. Patillo. Or
if you send it to both of us, Dr. Evans, that'd be great. Okay. And thank you for correcting. These days are running together now.
We have a different meeting together tomorrow. Elliot Hayes.
Yes.
There's a lot of meetings. And my other suggestion is you were talking about or asking about future presentations. Today we got a really good dose of kind of the foundation of what's going on in North Carolina data-wise and the history. I just wondered if we could kind of dive into, to some extent, and I don't know if we want to do this subcommittee-wise or not, but what's being done currently in the state as far as recruitment, retention, you know, what is currently happening so that we all know as a baseline. And it doesn't mean that everybody has to present, but if we have a general sense and we know how successful some of those happenings are throughout the state, you know, they might be more successful in the East or the West. Like Mr. Ford was talking about different areas of the state. It would be good for us to all be aware of that prior to going out into subcommittee meetings. And I'm also assuming that subcommittee meetings, just like subcommittee meetings for Pepsi, that they would have to be public and then they would have to be arranged separately ahead of time. Is that correct?
Mrs. Patillo, is that correct?
I will double check on that.
Okay.
I will double check on that.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank
you. Whether they are public or not, the committee will be privy to the information that's shared, you know, through the subcommittees. But that's a good question, and I will double check on that.
Thank you, Dr. Evans. And Cal, if you don't mind, if you can move back to the screen that shows the subcommittee assignments. I saw in the chat box. There we go. So you can see what those assignments are again. Got time for maybe one more question, comment?
Dr. Graham, this is Alfred Mays.
Yes, sir. How are you?
Good. Quick question. I'm not sure if this is for LaTanya or Dr. Graham, if you can answer. But item 3, back in the slide with the executive order.
Yes.
Assets and sources of funding. Will that be tied to recommendations or discussions or as a part of the plan, or would there be a subsequent exercise after the plan to discuss funding needs and how that bill will take place?
I'm going to answer, and then Mrs. Patillo can correct me if I'm wrong. I would prefer to do that work up front. So if we can begin to start identifying possible funding sources for the ideas that may emerge from these conversations. And then I am anticipating after the plan has been submitted, there will be subsequent actions, hopefully, that will lead to executing some of these ideas. But I would love for us to begin to do that work now so we can make the work on the back end a little bit easier for whomever that group may be, whether it's this group or another group. We've done some of the legwork for them so they can just jump into the activity as opposed to now thinking about who are the possible funders.
So there might be some cost structure discussions as a part of that.
Yes, I would.
Floating across the 3 subcommittees might be wise for
yes
funders to play in that space.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
If I may also add, as we look at programs that are already in place, we will be able to look at some of those funding structures and look at some of those financial supports and other supports that are already existing that will help us determine what kind of sources of funding will we need, what resources we'll need to leverage. If you want to continue those programs, then those numbers are already out there. If you want to do something different, we'll have to figure out additional sources of funding. So I think we'll have an opportunity to do that as we move along through the work.
Great. Thank you, LaTanya.
All right. Well, it's 3:56, and again, I told you I'm a stickler for time, so I'm going to close the discussion point at this point. What I'll ask you to do, though, is if you have additional questions, continue to send those through the chat area. We will record those and make sure that we circle back to engage in additional conversation relative to those inquiries. Again, thank you all for joining us today. We would like to express our sincere appreciation to our presenters, Mr. Ford, Dr. Lindsay, and Dr. Tomberlin. You should now see a schedule of our task force meetings through the summer. Our first subcommittee meetings will be held on May 19th and May 20th. All task force members are welcome to attend any of these subcommittee meetings, even if you are not listed as a subcommittee member. Registration information for these meetings will be sent in the next few days. Our next full group task force meeting will be on Tuesday, June 16th from 2 o'clock p.m. to 4 o'clock p.m. So I ask that you please add that to your calendar now. One final note, you will see a link to an evaluation for today's meeting through the chat feature. Please complete this evaluation to help inform how we are preparing for future meetings. And I'm going to take a privilege just here for a second. I've got 3 minutes, and I want to do this. There's a quote by Theodore Roosevelt. He gave a speech, and it's now dubbed "The Man in the Arena." And I want to read this quote as we begin to think about the work for this task force. So bear with me for just a moment. The quote reads, "It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat." Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for jumping into the arena. I want to thank you for taking the time to say, this is a cause that's worthy enough of my time, investment, intelligence, my talent, my treasure. Thank you up front for the work that you will be imparting into the overall task force. Thank you for the sweat equity that you will be issuing as we move forward. I'm looking forward to some great things resulting from this task force. I'm expecting a plan that is robust and comprehensive and that actually challenges the status quo of what we've been doing in this state for far too long. I'm expecting greatness, and I will demand greatness from each and every one of us. Thank you so very much for your time. At this time, I will accept a motion to adjourn.
Move to adjourn.
Thank you. Can I get a second?
Second, Alfred Mays.
Thank you. It's been moved and properly seconded that we adjourn. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Thank you so very much. This meeting is adjourned. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.